I'm so gosh darn excited because we have, in my opinion, a great episode tonight. Very pumped. Very pumped. We have joining us Randy Walsh, author of the book, The Apollo Moon Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight. It's a very well-reviewed, very high-selling book over on Amazon. He is an author, obviously, of this book. He's as well as a commercial pilot, certified flight instructor in the general aviation industry. He's also Canadian. We actually were chatting before this. We're from the towns right beside each other. What a small world, huh? And we're going to be bringing him on. Here we go. Randy Walsh, how you doing? Welcome to Low Value Mail. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it very much. We have an exciting show, and I appreciate you coming on. So, for people who don't know you, this is I've had a lot of requests for you. You've written 3 books titled The Apollo Moon Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight. So clearly, and we've had a lot of people request someone come on to discuss this exact topic. So I think you're as qualified as anybody. So first off, tell people a little bit about yourself before we get into things here.
Sure. And just a big hello to you, Danny. Thanks for having me on. And just very interesting to find out you're my next door neighbor over
I know, right?
Great little town. Great little town.
What are the odds?
Yeah. So I guess usually what people will ask me first is how I got involved in the Apollo Moon missions or the Apollo Moon mission hoax. And it's a kind of an interesting story. It happened about maybe 25 years ago. I had just came in from late one night from work and turned on TV, A&E. Just happened to be actually A&E back then was sort of tolerable. Not tolerable now, but it was tolerable then. They had a documentary on there about the Apollo missions, and I wasn't really paying much attention to it. So what happened was just walking around, listening to it, sort of, half listening to it, and then something caught my ear. And then I realized they were talking about Apollo 13. Now, for those of you out there that are not familiar with the Apollo missions, it's 5 decades ago. Apollo 13, according to the official narrative, had an accident on the way to the moon. So it basically blew an oxygen tank and it disabled the service module engine part of the command module. So they were in, according to the official version, they were in some very serious trouble, so dire straits. They were actually interviewing the 3 astronauts that were on that mission. And I remember one of the astronauts, and I believe now it was Commander Jim Lovell of that mission, they were talking about how they're going to swing around the moon and they were going to use the lunar module's engine to get them back to Earth. Now, they were using the moon as a gravity slingshot to get them back to Earth, gravity assist. Now, something struck me when he said this, and it really got my attention. He said how he was talking to his fellow astronaut, making it very clear that whatever you do, when I fire the engines, whatever you do, keep the Earth within a grid pattern on the window. So I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, hold on a second here. You're 250,000 miles from Earth and you're talking about navigating through visual means. That was really a first red flag for me because
you're in aviation. Like, are you?
Yeah.
You're in, right. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is kind of your wheelhouse.
Yeah. So at that time, I was just embarking on a commercial career. So I already had a pretty good background in navigation. And, one would think that on a mission to the moon and back, that you would have some sophisticated computers. Now, they did have computer on board, and we could talk about that later. But basically, this computer was not up to the task of navigating. And plus, they had to shut the main computer down because they had all moved into the lunar module, which at that time was still attached to the command module. So they were using visual references to navigate 250,000 miles back to Earth. Now, to put this into perspective, if you're like, let's say, 0.01 degree off course, you're in serious trouble. You could be thousands of miles off course by the
from
time
that from a 250,000 mile distance.
Exactly.
That tiny fraction.
Exactly.
It could be huge.
Exactly.
In what? Yeah. In the sense is that they have to, because they would have had to take a specific path to get back.
Exactly. So the way it works is they were sort of technically in an elliptical orbit around the Earth, even though they were at the moon. So it's basically an extended orbit from their track from the Earth to the moon. They were basically, according again, and I emphasize the official narrative because when I talk about this, people say, oh, you believe in the moon missions. No, I'm talking within the framework of the official narrative. And they were basically rewriting the rules and they were using visual cues to navigate. Now, the argument back to me has been that, well, They had to navigate through the stars anyway. That's another issue. And they're sort of half correct in that. But they've been using unmanned missions for years, even back then in the 1960s, that navigated to moon and back with no problem. So I didn't understand at the time, well, why are you using visual cues? Well, again, one would argue, well, because their mainframe computer had broken down, they had to shut that down. See, they had to shut everything down the command module to save energy because they had to rely on the lunar module. Instead of landing on the moon, now it's still attached to the command module. And they had to use that to navigate back and to get them back. So using visual cues by keeping the Earth within a grid pattern on the lunar module window.
And when you say like a visual cue, you're saying like, let's aim for east coast of the United States kind of thing?
Basically the whole Earth, keeping the whole Earth within a grid pattern.
Gotcha.
Now, I need to qualify something here. That was actually depicted in Ron Howard's movie, Apollo 13. And that's not exactly the way the official version has it. They were actually using a thing called the optics. So they were used, because of the way the spacecraft was aligned at that time, when it was heading back to Earth, they had to use the lunar module optics, which is what they would use if they were descending down to the moon. They'd use that for navigation. And it was through the optics, according to the official version, that they were using to keep the Earth within a grid pattern on the optic part, while Jim Lovell was firing the lunar module engine. Now, think about this for a second. You have to be very, very, very precise. I mean, you have to be precise just flying from, let's say, from here to Texas, from Toronto to Texas. Can you imagine with their limited fuel capacity at that time? They had limited fuel capacity to start out with, but now they have even less because they're using the lunar module, which is not designed to get them back to Earth. They're using the propellant on a lunar module to get them back. If they're off by as much as I mentioned earlier, 0.01 degrees, they're effectively off course by thousands of miles. They have no means of getting back on track, because it would have, by that time, it would have probably exhausted what propellant they had left, and they're effectively marooned in elliptical Earth orbit for eternity.
Right. And so are there any parts of it that you do accept? Because there's obviously a lot of theories as to why this would have been faked, right? This whole thing. I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so for me, it was more of a process. I mean, I didn't just say, oh, the missions were fake when I saw that. That was a red flag. But I never thought much of it after that. I remember thinking at the time, that doesn't seem right. They spent equivalent in today's money about $250 billion on this program. And they're using visual cues to get back to Earth in an emergency. Did they not plan properly for this?
Did they have the technology?
Well, proponents of the missions will tell you, yes, they did. They had the technology. But I would say after my years of research, which culminated in my 2 books and a third one actually coming out, no, they didn't have the technology. I mean, absolutely not. Now, I want to just mention that it took me several years later before I actually got into the details of these missions. All right. So Apollo 11 was basically the starting point because it was the first mission that supposedly landed on the moon. Right.
Yeah.
But it was Apollo 13 that actually got my attention. And I went from there. And it wasn't until the mid 2000s that I started looking, because there was a lot of information coming out on the internet at that time because it was becoming very popular. It was just becoming more mainstream. And I started looking at some of the videos, and I, of course, looked at all the hoax videos, the conspiracy videos. But I said, no. I got to really dive into this. So it took me several years, but I dove into NASA documents. I started ordering books on the official version. And to my surprise, actually, I found out that most of my information, intriguing information, actually came from official sources. It came from the official narrative. And that's what's really fascinating about this journey, is that the conspiracy books are good. The conspiracy videos are good, but they don't get into the details as much as they should. And I say to people, and you know the old saying, the devil is in the details. And when you actually dive into the official narrative and you read the manuals that are put out and you read books that are put out by people who support and promote the Apollo missions, that's where you find the smoking gun.
Right. And so what were these specific things? Because you're going through official NASA, I imagine, reports, documents at that point. Yeah. So what were the things once you started going through them where you started to kind of...
There's a million things that we could talk about here. And to say what was the one thing is very difficult to do. But what I can do is I can tell you what I focused on. And for me, I started with the Saturn V rocket, and more specifically, the F1 engines within the Saturn V rocket. Now, the F1 engines got a bit of a history. It's a very interesting history. The F1 engines to this day are still talked about as the most powerful liquid-fueled engines ever made. They work perfectly during the Apollo missions, and after that have never been used again. And when I look deeper into the subject of the F1 engines, and without the F1 engines, and I want to emphasize this, without the F1 engines, you would have had no Apollo moon landings, because the F1 engines needed to produce the power in order to launch the 46-ton payload into orbit, right? And that payload includes the command module, the service module, the lunar module. You have to, you need that kind of thrust to get that up into orbit. That's just to get it into orbit. Right? And if the F1 engines are not producing the power that is needed, if it's off slightly, it doesn't reach low Earth orbit, and you cannot have an Apollo moon landing. So that's where my starting point was, the F1 engines. And what I found out is that a lot of the data was fraudulent. Over the years, there's an individual who worked for Rocketdyne. Rocketdyne was the corporation that built the F1 engines, and he worked for Rocketdyne between 1958 and 1963. Now, his name is Bill Casing. And a lot of listeners tonight hearing this will know exactly who I'm talking about. And Bill Casing is being very much maligned in the last several decades, because he was the first one in 1977 to come out and write a book exposing the Apollo moon missions. Now, some of the things in that book he got wrong, but his basic premise was right, and I believe it still holds up to this day.
And he was the very first person who cast some doubt on the entire thing?
I wouldn't say cast doubt. I think there was a few that did cast doubt, but he was the first one to publish a book on it.
Okay.
And actually, as I mentioned earlier, he worked for Rocketdyne, and he was directly involved in cataloging the data output for the F1 engines at that time. So Rocketdyne had hired him as a data analyst, and a lot of people call him a paper pusher, but he was actually qualified. I mean, why would Rocketdyne hire him to analyze data on experimental engines that they were working on at the time if he wasn't qualified? Right. So obviously he was qualified. So his job is to catalog the data that they were working on in terms of the F1 engines, because by the time 1960, 1961 rolled along, when you had John F. Kennedy announce the Apollo moon missions, they needed a rocket. They needed a powerful rocket engine in order to make this mission successful. And that's when it switched over from a military purpose to the Apollo program. So the F1 engines were now being designed specifically for the Apollo moon program. And that's where Bill Casing saw that the data he was looking at was altered when it was released to the public.
Oh, when it was released to the public. So he kind of was seeing, and how is it being altered?
Basically, they were just changing the numbers to
just make the math work to essentially
that it's working and that it's meeting expectations, that it's meeting its design specifications. I have to put this into perspective. The average rocket engine back then produced about 200,000 pounds of thrust. In the Saturn program, they used the H1 engines, which was produced 200 pounds of thrust in the Saturn 1B. Now, the F1 engine, I think it had 8 engines in the H1 in the Saturn 1B rocket. Now, to put that into perspective, each rocket, as I said, each rocket engine produced about 200,000 pounds of thrust. The F1 engines was designed to produce 1.5 million pounds of thrust.
Wow.
That's a lot of power. And there was 5 engines designed into the Saturn V. So you had a total combined 7.5 million pounds of thrust. You needed that amount of power, that thrust, to lift that hardware I mentioned earlier, that 46 tons of Apollo spacecraft. It was the output that Bill Casing noticed was being altered to fit the narrative, to promote the idea that the Apollo missions were real. And he resigned in 1963 in disgust.
Right. And so what had they been doing leading up to the Apollo missions in terms of like technologically? Like, were they doing anything that was near?
You see, this is the thing, and this is what's really amazing. And, Bart Sabrillas talked a lot about this too. Basically, when Kennedy made that statement in 1961, I believe it was the United Nations or it was to the American Congress, one or the other, they had a total of 15 minutes experience in the suborbital flight with one astronaut. That's just with one astronaut. Mm-hmm. And that was with the Mercury program. That was you had Mercury program, then you had the Gemini program, and then you had the Apollo program. You had three main manned missions in the 1960s, and they were all leading up to the Apollo program. So in answer to your question is, they just barely got started when they announced this Apollo program. So they had 8 years. They had to invent the technology, then they had to design it, and then they had to manufacture it, and then they had to test it, all in 8 years. And we're talking 13 launches that they supposedly launched between 1969 to 1975. The last 2 years, actually, the Apollo program ended in 1972, but they launched, I think, 2 more. They launched the Skylab space station after that, and then it was discontinued. It was never used again. And here's the interesting part about all of this, is that Bill Kaysing noticed earlier how either information regarding the F-1 engines was either being fraudulent or was just written wrong. It was just blatant lies. And now a lot of those documents have disappeared, especially when it comes to the F-1 engines and the Saturn V rocket itself. A lot of the schematics have been destroyed. And you have to wonder, is that proof of the hoax? No, it's not proof. But when you look at that and you build on the details, then it becomes obvious that something nefarious was going on here.
Right. I mean, there's obviously the whole thing of why haven't they gone back? And there's, I forget who, but there's someone who's like, we don't have the technology to do that, right? And you're like, well, then what happened to it? There was what was it, all the deleted reels? Like they just lost them all?
Yeah. So that's very interesting because I wrote a chapter about that in my book, my first book. So for each mission, there was approximately 14,000 reels of telemetry tape. Now, the telemetry tape has 3 very important pieces of information on it. It had of course, the live visual feed from the moon surface. Then it had the biomedical information. And then it had basic telemetry from the spacecraft itself. And that was back then for people, you have to realize that this was the tape age. There was no digital computers back then. It was all tape to tape. It's all tape, yeah. Right? Analog. So basically what happened is it would be recorded onto one reel, and one reel contains about 15 minutes of information. So multiply that one reel, which is about the size of a car steering wheel, by 14,000. And that was what you had left over from the Apollo 11 missions, 14,000 reels of telemetry tapes. Well, those are the tapes that you're talking about. And yes, they have disappeared. And NASA has come out with all kinds of excuses. And basically, actually, they leave it up to their proponents to do that. And it's pretty comical sometimes. They come out and say, well, the tapes went missing but they had to tape over them because there was a tape shortage, to every excuse you can think of. My investigation shows, and I wrote this in my book, that NASA took those tapes out of the archives and NASA destroyed them. Not just the 14,000 reels of telemetry tapes for Apollo 11, all of them. So we're talking over 140,000 reels of telemetry tapes have gone missing from the National Archives related to all of the Apollo missions. Remember, there were 6 of them that landed on the moon, supposedly, and all of that data is gone.
Every single one of it. And they say that it was either overwritten due to just a resource shortage. Yeah, that's one of the answers. I mean, you think they'd have unlimited resources. That's
the most popular answer. Actually, the most popular answer I've had from the proponents is that, well, there was a tape shortage. And, it really boggles the mind when you think about it, because we're talking about NASA here. We're talking about billions of dollars in resources. Right. You would think that they could have a few extra dollars to buy a few more tapes. So my investigation showed, and this is again in the book, and this is coming from NASA. This is what's really baffling. This is actually coming from NASA itself. If people just look at the details and read the details, NASA itself says those tapes, all of them, were signed out by NASA from the National Archives in the early 1970s. The tape shortage that they're talking about didn't happen until the early 1980s. And what's more, all those tapes that were signed out, the Apollo telemetry tapes that were signed out, they broke protocol. They didn't follow procedure. NASA's written on the documents as the ones who signed it out, but there's no specific name, so there's no paper trail.
Right.
And they disappeared after that.
And why so? Because it seems pretty sloppy. Is it just because they thought nobody would ever kind of poke around? I mean, that's kind of almost on par with the dog ate my homework.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there are reasons why are open to speculation, but my speculation is the one I really stand by the most is NASA had to get those tapes back. from the archives. They had to destroy them, because what if, and this actually happened, what if some intrepid scientist or documentary movie producer comes along and says, I want the tapes so as I can access the data to make a really good documentary for you to promote the anniversary. Well, can you imagine the shock of listening back to those tapes and finding out that there's nothing on them?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And that would be your proof. And that actually happened. Ron Howard, again, he decided he wanted to make a 40th anniversary, an anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission, the first mission to land on the moon back in 2009. So he contacted NASA and he said, I'd like to have the telemetry tapes because I'd like to access the live feed, because he wanted to put it on IMAX, right?
Yeah.
So great idea at the time, until he was informed, well, we don't have the tapes. They don't exist, and we don't know where they are. And our investigation shows that they haven't turned up. So he had to resort to using old VHS video footage for his documentary, and people can look that up. That's all fact.
Right. And so do you think that the entire thing was just a Cold War necessity essentially by the United States government in order they needed to show that they had been to the moon?
I think that's the impression they wanted to give, but I'm convinced of that now.
It seems like they definitely had the motive in terms of the Cold War of wanting to compete with the Russians. Everybody's saying, it was filmed at a soundstage or whatever. They definitely had the incentive to do that. That's clear, I think.
Yeah, that's one level. There are many levels to this. And that's kind of like, and I'm basically not putting people down because I thought that myself too, but that's basically a two-dimensional approach to it. I believe now, from all the research that I've done, that the Russians knew damn well that these missions were faked back in 1969. They knew where they were going to fake it before they even launched Apollo 11. And I believe that there is some evidence, actually more than circumstantial evidence, that the Russians not only knew about this, but that the Americans and the Russians were working very closely together on it.
The Russians and the Americans were working together to fake the moon landing.
Not so much to fake the moon landing. The Russians knew about it. The Russians got in on this and they knew what was going on. I mean, these are not stupid people. They have some very brilliant scientists, and they were further ahead in their manned space program. In every category you look at in the 1960s, from all their manned launches, they were the first to put an astronaut in orbit. A full orbit, a full low Earth orbit. They were the first to put 2 astronauts in orbit. They were the first to put a woman in orbit. They were the first to put 3 astronauts in orbit. And they were the first to actually have 2 spaceships in orbit and rendezvous and dock. They were first in everything they did. They were number 1.
Right. So then
but
why?
Somehow the Americans came back, just shot ahead from a suborbital flight in 1961 and landed a man on the moon in 1969. And when you think about the technological leap that takes, the technological leap that would involve, anybody who sits back, just look at how technology works. Technology doesn't work like that. It's a progression. It's layered on top of each other, just like we see with aviation. We see with ships in aviation, right? You just don't fly across the ocean in a jet. You've got to get there first. So you got there with the single engine airplane, single engine prop. And then we build from that. Yeah. And then, of course, there's no documents for that left because we don't need those documents because we've already built on that technology. Unlike the Apollo moon missions, it's not just the documents for the Saturn V and the F-1 engines that have disappeared. Grumman, the corporation who made the lunar module, and the corporations that manufactured these spacecraft have basically destroyed their own schematics.
Right. And so just going back to this Russia-U.S. kind of alliance, I guess. So if you're saying that they knew about it, to what end? What was the purpose of that? The idea is that they were enemies at the time. Yeah. Right. Yeah. But you're saying they were actually working together. So I guess.
Well, I wouldn't say they're the best of friends. Okay. So I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that they're, buddies behind the scenes. What I'm saying is that they both understood the reality. They both play their people. All right. Okay. We were being played. The Russian people were being played. It's a form of control. And I think you alluded to that earlier when you asked me what was the reason. You gave a reason. And I would have to say that that's one of the primary reasons, because it creates an illusion and it creates a form of control and manipulation. And it's just one part of a whole. The Apollo missions itself doesn't stand alone in this. You have to layer in many other factors. And it takes quite a while to go through all this. But I do believe that the Russians knew about. And in fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but when the Apollo 13 splashed down, and that was the one I mentioned earlier that had the so-called accident, to this day, there are 2 Apollo 13 capsules on display. The question is, where did the other one come from?
Yeah.
So what happened is, and this is all fact, this is again not speculation, there are actual media reports of the Soviet Union at that time handing over what they call a boilerplate command module to the Americans on a Coast Guard. There's actual footage of this. The USA Stripes, that military magazine, was posting articles about this. The Russians had picked up a command module in the North Atlantic Ocean and brought it back to one of their military bases in the Soviet Union called Mansk. I think it was the city of Mansk. And they went through a big ceremony of handing that back. So the question is, where did that command module come from? Well, a boilerplate means that it's a dummy command module. What they use is when they don't want to launch an actual command module and they're just testing a rocket, they put a dummy on top.
Yeah.
Right? So how is it that there's no record of a missing boilerplate command module? There's no record of that. The only record we have is the Apollo 13 splashdown. But yet the Russians, on the very next day after the Apollo 13 launch, picked up a command module boilerplate that's used for training. How did it get in close proximity to their territorial waters? That's the question.
And what do you think? It was just placed there?
Or did the Apollo 13 launch fail? And was that...
And that's another option. They were doing this for elements of control, I guess. I'm curious, kind of, if you can maybe elaborate, expand on that a little bit. Just, I'm interested what your thoughts are about that.
First of all, it's very difficult to prove what I'm saying. But second of all, you have to look, when you look at all the details, you sort of get into that situation. Well, why would they be doing this? What is the whole point? Is this more a psychological operation? Is this a psyops on both our peoples here in North America, the Soviet Union at the time, and the rest of the world? And it's very interesting to note that President Kennedy, months before he was assassinated, had ordered the director of NASA at that time, James Webb, to meet with his Russian counterpart in their space program and work out a possible agreement. Remember, it was Kennedy that launched this in 1961, and there's now evidence coming out that Kennedy was actually going to cancel the Apollo moon program in favor of detente and working more closely with the Soviets, which they were working with anyway, but they were going to come out in public. And I think that would have been a major blow to the agenda in terms of control, because the only way to control people is to give them an enemy. And, the Americans are really good at that. And so are the Soviets too. I'm not knocking America. I like America. But I'm just saying that, give them an enemy, give them somebody to hate. It's a form of control. Hey, we went to the moon. We landed there. It's all about hubris, right?
Right.
We landed there. We're great. We're number one and we're proud. And it just is a domino effect from that point on.
Right. Okay. We got a call. One moment, please. All right, go ahead. You're on with Randy.
Hey, what's going on, Randy? First off, I have a background in geology. I did want to bring up the Soviet stuff. First thing with the Soviets, you're familiar with the lost cosmonaut conspiracy theory? And I don't think it's really much of a conspiracy theory, but the whole thing that Yuri Gagarin was not the first human in space, but he was the first human to return from space. The Soviet Union, they sent up maybe 1 to 3 confirmed cosmonauts who didn't make it back to Earth, but they, refuted the news. Are you familiar with this conspiracy theory by chance?
Vaguely, yes. I didn't really pay much attention to it, but there's been a lot of, on both sides, a lot of misinformation and disinformation. So you got to be careful. You got to pick and choose what you want to go with. But go ahead.
So with the Soviet Union, first off, it's it has been well known, especially with that fake that happened in Chernobyl. Soviet Union covers up all failures. They're no, we can only display the best of our abilities. And that's just one thing you're talking about, associating with cosmonauts and astronauts. But my thing is, what do you know about the lunar samples? Because as a geologist, I've done things like hyperspectral analysis of mineral samples, and it works 100% of the time, where you can identify rock as you know what it is by hyperspectral analysis. It gives you a spectral response based on light bouncing back from the rock material you hold in your hand. But why isn't there any of that done on the lunar samples? And also, I wouldn't trust if they would do it themselves. I would have to have them go to the factory that makes the hyperspectral analysis machines
So let's start with a couple of things here first. So there's, again, a lot of misinformation and disinformation when it comes to this. First of all, I'm not a geologist. I'm just going by what I've read. And from people I have talked to who have a lot more experience and are qualified, a lot more experience in this. We know that a year before the launch of Apollo 11, that Wernher von Braun and a whole crew of his entourage had flown down to the South Pole, and they were gathering samples of moon rock. And so we know that, and we know that for a fact, right? They actually gathered, I think it was several hundred pounds, and they brought it back. And the question is, why were they doing that? Were they doing that to see what it's like to actually test the moon rock? Well, couldn't they just wait till they get moon rock from the moon? So they had done that. Second of all, I have read instances where NASA will say that there's no water droplets or no moisture at any content at all in moon rock samples. Yet then I've read from their own narrative that they have found water samples, and this is going back 40 years. So there's, again, a lot of, back and forth misinformation. And the other question is, and this is the one I really like to focus on a lot, is, okay, so they say they have brought back an estimated, I think it was 800 pounds total of moon rock between all the 6 missions. So that works out to 140 pounds per mission. And not every mission was 140 pounds of moon rock. Some was 50 and some was 200. But how did they get them back into Earth's atmosphere? Because you're adding a lot of weight to the command module. And that's the angle that I like to go. And I haven't found a reasonable answer. When you're re-entering the atmosphere, you're getting into some serious forces. And that's when weight and balance becomes an issue, more so on reentry. That added weight that they picked up from the moon, let's say they picked up 75, 80 pounds of moon rock, is not properly distributed within the spacecraft. That is, spacecraft comes in angled incorrectly and will burn up and kill the crew instantly. So that's kind of the angle I was looking at that. I leave the geology aspect of this up to the people who are qualified to look into this. Jared White is one example. He's done some very good work on this. But that's kind of the angle where I came from, is just that it's easy to say, well, they brought back several hundred pounds of moon rock. First of all, nobody's ever seen a photo of that. And second of all, to your other question you brought up, I too wouldn't trust NASA to investigate itself when it comes to the moon rock. But NASA is very careful about who inspects those moon rocks. Those moon rocks, people who inspect those moon rocks, they have to be scientists that are very heavily screened by NASA. They need to be working for established institutions or corporations that directly or indirectly get their funding from government. You're not going to get a scientist or a geologist who is outside of that frame, who is independent. You're not going to get any of them asked to test the samples that they have in NASA locked up right now.